The police cruiser didn't slow down. It cut across 3 lanes of hospital traffic and screeched sideways into the entrance, blocking the walkway completely. And the woman in scrubs heading toward the doors had exactly 2 seconds before the officer stepped out with his hand already resting on his belt. She stopped. He stared. And in that moment, nobody watching from the lobby windows could figure out why a cop who'd just arrived looked at a nurse like she was the most dangerous thing in the parking lot. What happened next would end 2 careers, change a hospital's policy forever, and prove that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one you should have been afraid of all along. If this story pulls you in, stay until the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The morning shift started at 6:45. Marlow General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Crest Fall, Montana, a mid-size regional trauma center that served 4 counties and a military installation 30 miles north. It wasn't the biggest hospital in the state, and it wasn't the best funded, but it was where people ended up when things went wrong fast. When the roads iced over in February and the highway swallowed cars whole. When the training ranges outside Fort Callum had accidents that the Army tried to keep quiet until they couldn't. It was that kind of place. Serious, unglamorous, necessary. Sarah Voss pulled into the staff lot at 6:38, 7 minutes early, which was the only way she knew how to arrive anywhere. She was 31 years old, medium height, with short dark hair she didn't bother styling and a face that looked younger than it was until you looked at her eyes. Her eyes were older than the rest of her. They'd seen things that left a mark. The kind of mark that doesn't show up in photographs but sits right there when you meet someone and makes you instinctively lower your voice. She'd spent 4 years as a combat medic attached to rapid response evac units in 2 different overseas deployments. She'd pulled people out of rubble, worked trauma in helicopters, held pressure on wounds while being yelled at through radio static by surgeons 50 miles away. She had a clinical memory that her former unit commander once described as terrifying in the best possible sense. She remembered every drug interaction she'd ever studied. She knew the sound a lung made when it was about to collapse before any monitor could tell you. She was also, at this particular moment, wearing dark green scrubs, carrying a tote bag with a broken strap she kept meaning to replace, and walking toward the main entrance of Marlow General like any other Thursday. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't wearing any insignia. She had her hospital ID badge clipped to her left chest pocket. Standard issue, photo, name, department, emergency trauma services, level 2 coordinator. And she had a cup of gas station coffee in her right hand because the stuff they brewed in the staff break room tasted like hot sadness. It was a normal morning, right up until it wasn't. The cruiser came in fast. She heard it before she saw it. Tires against asphalt, engine growling, the specific sound of a vehicle that wasn't planning to stop until it felt like it. She turned, instinctively stepping back, and the black and white Crestfall PD cruiser fishtailed slightly as it cut across the drop-off lane and angled to a stop directly between her and the entrance doors. Not parked. Positioned. The driver's door opened. The officer who stepped out was built wide across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something dense and humorless. His name tag read D. Rourke, Deputy Dale Rourke. He had 9 years on the Crestfall force, a commendation he kept framed in his living room and a reputation that the good officers on the department had quietly been embarrassed by for the better part of 3 years. He looked at Sarah the way some people look at a receipt for something they didn't order. Hey. He didn't say it like a greeting. He said it like a command. Hold on. Sarah stopped walking. She looked at him. Good morning. Where are you headed? She glanced at the hospital entrance 12 feet behind him, then back at him. Work. You work here? Yes. He came around the hood of the cruiser slowly, one thumb hooked into his belt, not walking toward a colleague, circling. She recognized the posture. It was something she'd seen in conflict zones when local officials wanted to establish dominance before a conversation started. It was a technique. It was meant to make you feel surrounded even when only one person was standing there. Got some ID? She reached for her badge. Right here. Not that. Real ID. Driver's license. She paused. You want my driver's license? Is that a problem? It wasn't a question. She shifted her coffee to her left hand and pulled her wallet from the tote bag, handed him the license without comment. He looked at it longer than necessary. Then he looked back at her, then back at the license. It was a performance. She'd seen that too. Sarah Voss? He said it like he was testing the weight of it. That's me. You said you work here. I do. Doing what? She touched her badge again. Emergency trauma coordinator. If you look at... I'm asking you. He handed back the license without looking at her. What do you actually do here? Something tightened behind her eyes. Not anger. She'd learned to keep anger somewhere small and interior, but recognition. She recognized what was happening. She'd been in enough situations where someone with authority had decided, before a single fact was established, what the outcome was going to be. This was one of those situations. The decision had been made before she reached the door. She just didn't know what the decision was yet. I coordinate trauma response, she said. I work with the ER team during mass casualty events, critical intake, and surgical preparation for high-acuity patients. He looked at her scrubs, her tote bag, her gas station coffee. Uh-huh. He said it like she'd just told him she flew planes recreationally. You have any documentation beyond that badge? The badge is documentation. I need something official. From the hospital. Yeah. That I'm standing outside of. He didn't blink. That's correct. She studied him for a moment. A small part of her, the part that had spent years learning how to read people in situations where misreading them had real consequences, understood that there was nothing she could say right now that would satisfy him. He wasn't waiting for a correct answer. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted her frustrated or defensive or loud enough that he had something to point to. She didn't give him any of it. I can go through the staff entrance on the east side, she said. I have keycard access. Don't go anywhere yet. Am I being detained? Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of recalibration. I'm asking questions. That's not an answer, ma'am. Am I being detained or am I free to go to work? He stepped closer. Not enough to be physical, but enough to be deliberate. You need to watch your tone. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She stood exactly where she was, weight balanced, posture neutral. She'd learned that in a different context, how to occupy space without escalating it, how to hold a position without turning it into a confrontation. It had saved her life once, in a different country, in circumstances she rarely talked about. My tone is calm, she said. I'm asking a procedural question. A small crowd had formed, a orderly near the automatic doors, a visitor with a paper coffee cup who'd stopped walking, two nurses from the overnight shift who were on their way out and had slowed their steps. Rourke seemed to register the audience and didn't like what it might mean for him. He recalibrated, changed tactics. You know what? He turned slightly, making his voice bigger. We've had some issues around this entrance lately. Unauthorized access, people trying to come in without clearance. I'm just doing my job. Nobody said anything. I don't make the rules, he added. Sarah looked at the people watching. She looked at the entrance. She looked at the badge on her chest, which had her photograph on it, her name, her department, and a QR code that linked directly to her hospital employment file. She looked back at Rourke. Your job, she said quietly, is to protect people, not stop them. She watched his jaw tighten. And then the entrance doors opened and Hospital Administrator Victor Ashby stepped out. Victor Ashby was 53, silver-haired, and had the specific energy of a man who'd spent 20 years managing institutional optics. He wasn't a bad person, exactly. He was the kind of person who'd learned to weigh situations by what they cost rather than what they meant. And that habit had grown into something he didn't always notice in himself. He looked at the scene in front of him. Sarah Voss standing on the walkway, Officer Rourke beside his cruiser, a small cluster of witnesses. He made a calculation in about 3 seconds. What's going on here? He directed the question at Rourke, not at Sarah. Routine check, Rourke said. Just verifying access credentials. Ashby looked at Sarah briefly. He knew her. He'd been present during her hire 7 months ago. He'd seen her name in 3 separate commendation reports from the ER attending and the trauma chief. He knew exactly who she was. We appreciate the diligence, he said to Rourke. Sarah turned to look at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The question was there in her expression. Plain, direct, not angry. Ashby didn't quite meet her eyes. "Sarah, why don't you come around through the east entrance today? Let's not hold up the—" "She's already here," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Dr. Priya Nambiar, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Marlow General, was standing in the entrance with a tablet in her hand and a look on her face that could have stripped paint. She was 50 years old, 5'4", and had the kind of authority that had nothing to do with height or volume. She'd trained at Johns Hopkins. She'd run emergency departments in Detroit and San Diego before coming to Crestfall. She had no patience for theater when there was work to do. She looked at Rourke. "Officer." He straightened slightly, instinctively. "Dr. Nambiar." "Why is my trauma coordinator standing in the parking lot instead of in the building?" A pause. "I was verifying Her badge verifies her. The QR code on that badge links to our credentialing system. You can scan it with your phone. It would have taken you 11 seconds. She looked at him steadily. "Was there a different issue?" Rourke's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Ashby. Ashby, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything useful. "Sarah." Priya stepped fully out of the doorway and held it open. "Come in. We've got a briefing at 7. Sarah picked up her tote bag. At some point during the exchange, she'd set it down. She didn't remember doing that, which meant her hands had been ready, and walked past both Rourke and Ashby without looking at either of them. She walked past Priya, who let the door close behind them. The morning light caught Rourke standing by his cruiser with nothing to do. Inside, the corridor was already moving. 7th floor was up for shift change. The ER was turning over a chest pain from overnight. Someone's monitor was alarming 3 rooms down. Priya fell into step beside Sarah. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes." "That's happened before, with Rourke. I figured it wasn't his first time. There have been 3 complaints in 18 months. Nothing's stuck." Priya said it without editorializing, the way a doctor presents a diagnosis. Here is the situation, here are the facts. Ashby thinks managing the relationship with the department is more valuable than... She stopped herself. "Anyway, how's your coffee?" "Terrible. There's a pot in Trauma Bay 2 that someone brought from home. It's actually drinkable." Sarah almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. It was the kind that lives at the corner of the mouth when something is genuinely small and good in the middle of something that isn't. She filed the interaction with Rourke in the place she kept things like that, not forgetting them, not letting them take up too much room, and turned her attention to the shift ahead. She didn't know yet that the shift would not be ordinary. She didn't know yet what was coming from the north. The briefing at 7 covered 3 active cases from overnight, a scheduled surgical prep for a vascular patient, and a note about ventilator availability in ICU. Standard. Sarah took her notes on paper. She'd never trusted tablets during briefings, a habit from years of working in environments where screens failed at the worst moments, and asked 2 questions that nobody else had thought to ask, which was also a habit. By 8:15, she was in the trauma unit, working alongside a charge nurse named Tom Brecky, who was 46, from Billings, and who had a gift for logistics that made him invaluable during high-volume periods. Tom could track 6 patients simultaneously, anticipate supply needs before they arose, and communicate with surgeons in a tone that was somehow both deferential and completely non-negotiable. Sarah had worked with him for 6 months and trusted him the way you trust tools that have never let you down. "Rourke again?" Thomas said without preamble when she arrived. "How'd you know?" Kelsey from overnight saw it from the lobby window. Word travels fast in this building. He handed her a chart. "You want to file something?" "Not yet." Tom gave her a look that communicated disagreement without argument. It was another skill she appreciated in him. The morning moved the way trauma mornings do. Not calmly, but predictably. Controlled chaos has a rhythm to it, and people who thrive in emergency medicine learn to hear that rhythm and work inside it. Sarah moved through the unit with the kind of efficiency that wasn't showy. She didn't narrate what she was doing, she just did it, and somehow the people around her found themselves doing the right thing at the right time. and often they didn't notice until later that she'd been the reason why. At 10:40, she was reviewing prep notes for an incoming surgical case when Tom appeared in the doorway of the consult room. Something was different in his face. "What?" she said. "Got a call from the front desk." He kept his voice level. "Rourke's back." She set down the chart. "He's asking to speak with administration about the incident this morning." Tom paused. "Apparently he's filing a formal complaint about you." The air in the room didn't change. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Not alarm, not anger, something more like a door closing quietly, something settling. "On what grounds?" "Interfering with a law enforcement officer." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Is there footage from the entrance?" "There's always footage from the entrance." "Then there's nothing to manage." She picked up the chart again. "Get me the prep notes for the vascular case. Kovac wants to go at 11:30, and I need to be ready." Tom stayed in the doorway a half-second longer than he needed to. He was reading her the way good nurses read patients, not for what they said, but for what they were actually communicating. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before," he said. Not a question. Different context. She didn't look up from the chart. Same people. He left. She finished the prep notes. But Rourke filing a complaint against her, that was a move. That was him deciding that the morning hadn't gone his way and trying to correct it through institutional channels. It was the kind of move that worked sometimes, in hospitals where administration would rather smooth things over than make waves, where the path of least resistance ran straight through the person who'd done nothing wrong, because that person was easier to manage than the one with a badge. She thought about Victor Ashby's face that morning, the way he'd looked at her and then looked away. She'd seen that calculation before. She knew what it usually led to. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known at 10:40 on a Thursday in the Marlow General Trauma Unit, was that the calculation was about to become irrelevant, because 53 miles to the north on a training range outside Fort Callum, something had already gone wrong. The call came in at 11:07. It came through the military liaison line that Marlow General maintained specifically for coordination with Fort Callum, a line that got used maybe 6 times a year for minor things, and very occasionally for something serious. Priya Nambiar took the call in her office. She listened for 45 seconds. Then she put down the phone and walked to the trauma unit with the specific kind of controlled speed that experienced doctors use when they don't want everyone to see them running. She found Sarah coming out of the supply corridor. "Conference room," Priya said. "Now." They walked. Fast. "What happened?" Sarah asked. Priya pushed open the conference room door and made sure it closed behind them. "Training accident at Callum. Explosive ordnance simulation. Something went wrong during a live demonstration. They're saying partial detonation, multiple casualties, 4 critical." She set her tablet on the table. "They're transporting to us. ETA 40 minutes. Sarah felt something shift inside her. A switch she recognized. Something that came up automatically. From years of training and experience and necessity, and it didn't feel like heroism. It never did, in her experience. It felt like a gear engaging, like the work coming into focus. "What's the Army sending with them?" "Liaison officer and 2 medics. They want their personnel on site during treatment." Priya pulled up a screen. "The complication is staffing. Dr. Kovac is already in surgery. Harrington called out sick yesterday. I've got Delisle available, but she hasn't run a multi-critical intake in..." "I've got it." Priya stopped, looked at her. "You'll coordinate?" "Yes. I need Tom on logistics. I need OR2 and 3 prepped for concurrent use, and I need someone to get me an accurate equipment inventory from the trauma bays before those vehicles arrive. 40 minutes is enough if we start now." Priya was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Sarah with something in her eyes that wasn't surprise exactly, more like confirmation, like something she'd suspected being established as fact. "The Army liaison is going to want to brief you directly," she said. "Then send him to me when he gets here." Sarah was already moving toward the door. "But we set up first. Brief after." She was in the hallway before Priya could respond. The next 34 minutes were a different kind of morning. Sarah moved through the trauma unit, and it reorganized around her. not because she was loud or forceful, but because she was precise. She told Tom what she needed, and he made it happen. She walked through OR 2 and 3 with the surgical prep nurses and identified 2 equipment gaps and got them filled. She reviewed what little medical information the Army had transmitted ahead of the casualties and made intake assignments based on injury type, updating them twice as new information came in. At some point during all of this, Victor Ashby appeared in the corridor. She noticed him the way you notice ambient noise, registered, not engaged with. "Sarah?" He fell into step beside her. "I need to talk to you about the situation with Officer Rourke." "Not right now." "He's filed a formal—" "I know, not right now." She turned into the supply corridor. "We have a mass casualty event incoming from Fort Callum. 4 critical, more walking wounded. I need you out of this corridor unless you have something operational to contribute." He stopped walking. She didn't. "The complaint is—" "Victor." She stopped and turned around. Her voice was the same volume it had been all morning, calm, not warm. "I am 40 seconds away from being unavailable for the next several hours. If you want to discuss whatever Rourke told you, I'll be here at the end of my shift. Right now, I need this hallway clear." Something in his expression, the administrative composure, the practiced neutrality, slipped for just a moment. He looked at her the way he probably hadn't let himself look at her all morning, like someone who was very good at something he wasn't. He stepped aside. She walked. At 11:49, the first vehicle arrived. 3 military transport vehicles pulled into the Marlow General Emergency Bay with a sound that cut through the morning. Engines, radio communication, the particular controlled urgency of trained personnel working a real situation. 2 Army medics were out of the first vehicle before it fully stopped. The liaison officer, a tall man in his late 30s with captain's bars and a face that was managing a lot of information simultaneously, came around from the passenger side and scanned the bay entrance. He was looking for someone. Tom Brecky was at the bay door. "Trauma coordinators inside. We're ready for intake." The captain nodded, moved. The sliding bay doors opened and the captain came through into the intake corridor, where Sarah was standing with a chartboard and a headset, and where Tom had already arrayed the trauma team in positions for receiving. The captain looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm Voss," she said. "What are we working with?" He read her badge, read her face. Then he pivoted into operational mode, the way field officers do when they've decided someone's worth talking to. 4 critical, as reported. GSW to the left chest on the first, that's your most urgent. Blast overpressure on 2 and 3. Possible spinal involvement on one of them, I'll flag which. 4th is femoral bleed controlled but needs surgery now. 7 additional walking wounded, 2 of those probably have fractures we haven't x-rayed. Understood. She turned to Tom. Bay 1, chest wound, get Delisle in the thoracic kit. Bay 2, I'm taking the femoral, get me into surgery within 8 minutes. Bays 3 and 4 for blast casualties, flag Dr. Nambiar for spinal assessment on the one the captain marks. She looked back at the captain. The walking wounded. Is any of them at risk for delayed presentation? He blinked. It was a question that field medics asked, not hospital coordinators. One of them took a concussive hit and was ambulatory post-incident, he said carefully, but he's been declining in the past 20 minutes. Headache, nausea. He's not walking wounded. He's a 5th critical. Get him into a bay immediately. She turned again. Tom, already moving, Tom said from somewhere behind her. And the machinery of it started. Out in the parking lot, because no one had thought to ask him to leave, Officer Dale Rourke was standing beside his cruiser, making a phone call. He'd returned to Marlow General at 10:30 with the intention of filing his complaint in person and making sure Ashby understood the seriousness of what had happened. He'd been kept waiting in the administrative lobby for 40 minutes, and then someone had come out and told him quietly that the administrator was unavailable due to a developing medical situation and would need to reschedule. He'd gone back to his cruiser. He was on the phone with his sergeant now, explaining the morning, explaining the complaint, explaining why the nurse had been in violation of... He stopped talking. Because through the windshield, he could see the military vehicles in the emergency bay. He could see the personnel moving. He could see, through the bay windows that faced the parking lot at an angle, figures in scrubs working fast around gurneys. He lowered his phone slowly. The radio on his belt crackled. Standard traffic. He didn't register it. What he registered was the captain from Fort Callum walking out of the bay entrance, speaking into his headset, and then stopping when a hospital administrator, Ashby, approached him and said something. The captain listened, pointed back toward the bay, kept pointing. Ashby's posture changed. Rourke couldn't hear any of it, but he watched Ashby walk back to the entrance, watched him stand there for a moment with his hand on the door frame and his head slightly bowed, like a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. Inside that bay, Sarah Voss was working, and somewhere in the distance, though Rourke had no way to know it yet, the footage from the entrance camera that morning had already been flagged by hospital security, automatically, as part of a new monitoring protocol that had been implemented after a different incident 6 weeks ago. The footage had a timestamp. It had audio. It had 11 minutes and 43 seconds of a uniformed officer blocking a hospital staff member from entering a medical facility during a scheduled work shift, requesting identification without cause, and escalating when that staff member asked a procedural question. The footage was already in a folder. The folder was already on a server. And 2 people, a hospital security supervisor and a records coordinator who worked the early shift, had already watched it once and exchanged a look across a break room table that said everything neither of them was ready to say out loud yet. In the trauma bay, a 23-year-old Army specialist with a femoral bleed was on the table. Sarah Voss was already working. The specialist's name was Cortez. She knew that because the Army medic who'd prepped him in transit had taped it to his wrist in marker, last name, blood type, and a small check mark next to conscious on departure that told her he'd been awake when they loaded him and wasn't now. His pressure was dropping in the way that femoral bleeds drop when the controlled becomes uncontrolled, which was the specific scenario she'd trained for so many times that her hands already knew what they were doing before her mind finished processing the intake data. Pressure, she said. 74/40 and falling, the intake nurse said. Get me 2 large bore IVs, right arm. Run saline wide open. Where's Delisle? Bay 1. Good. Keep her there. She looked at Cortez's face, young, slack, the particular gray-white that meant his body was pulling blood from the extremities to protect the core. 23 years old, probably. Maybe 24. She had no room right now for what that meant in any human sense, so she put it where she always put it, behind the work, where it would stay until she was done, and then she would deal with it later. And sometimes later never came because there was always more work, and she'd learned that was both a professional liability and the thing that kept her functional. Ortho kit, she said, and get OR2 on standby. This isn't stopping with compression. It didn't. The next 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that don't exist in narrative time. They existed in a different dimension entirely, compressed and expanded simultaneously, measured not in minutes but in decisions and responses and the sound of monitors and the smell of antiseptic and blood. She worked. Everyone around her worked. The machinery of a well-run trauma response, when it functions the way it's supposed to, looks almost choreographed from the outside. But from the inside, it feels like controlled falling. Like moving so fast that the only thing keeping you upright is momentum and training and the specific refusal to consider what happens if you stop. Cortez went to OR2 at 12:18. The vascular surgeon met them at the door and Sarah gave the handoff in 45 seconds. Everything relevant, nothing extra, the way she'd learned to brief in the field where time was a resource you didn't waste. The surgeon nodded once. Didn't say good job or thank you because there wasn't space for that yet. Just nodded and went in. She turned around. Tom was beside her with a chartboard and the expression of a man who had been running alongside a fast vehicle and was now deciding whether to flag it down or let it keep going. Blast casualties are stable, he said. Spinal concern on the second one. Nambiar's in with her. Third one has a shattered radius. Ortho is coming down. The concussion case is... He paused. He's having a harder time than we hoped. What's his pressure doing? Stable, but his neuropresentation is getting worse. He's confused, combative, started seizing about 12 minutes ago. She was already walking. Why didn't you pull me? Because you were literally elbow deep in a femoral bleed and there was nothing you could add in that moment that the team wasn't already doing. She couldn't argue with that. She hated that she couldn't argue with it. The 5th critical, the concussion case the captain had flagged, was in Bay 4. His name, per the wristband, was Okafor. He was 27 from the Army's Combat Engineering Unit, and he had a subdural hematoma that had been presenting as a mild headache 2 hours ago and was now presenting as a full neurological emergency. He was on his side on the gurney, restrained at the wrist because he'd already pulled out one IV, and there was a second-year resident named Marcus who was doing his best and visibly aware that his best was at its ceiling. Sarah came through the curtain, and Marcus looked at her the way people look at a door opening when they've been alone in a room for too long. "Walk me through it," she said. He did. Fast, thorough, a little rattled, but accurate. She listened and assessed simultaneously. Pupils, posture, the quality of his breathing, the rhythm of the seizure activity that had stopped but left residue in the way his hands were trembling. "He needs neurosurg," she said. "Call it in." "I did. They're 20 minutes out." "Who's on?" "Calloway." "Good. Get me a repeat CT. Current. I want to see if this bleed is expanding." She turned to the nurse on the other side. "What's his last GCS?" 9. 9. That was down from what she'd been told at intake. She looked at Okafor's face. The involuntary movement behind the eyelids, the muscular tension that comes when the brain is misfiring, and she made the calculation that neurosurgeons make, and that she was not technically authorized to make but had been making in various forms since she was 23 years old in a tent with inadequate equipment and a patient who couldn't wait for someone with the right title to arrive. "If Calloway's 20 minutes out and this bleed is expanding, 20 minutes is too long," she said to Marcus. "Not as a judgment, as a fact. Pull up his imaging from intake and the repeat side by side the moment it's done. We make that call together. Understood?" Marcus understood. She left Bay 4 moving fast, and as she came back into the main corridor, she almost walked directly into the Fort Callum liaison captain, who had apparently been looking for her. "Voss?" He stepped slightly in front of her, not blocking, just redirecting. His name, she'd learned from the intake sheet, was Captain Derek Wall. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor things, not age, and the kind of eyes that were used to tracking multiple things at once. "I need 30 seconds, he said. She stopped. "You have them." "How's Cortez?" "In surgery. Vascular's good. His best odds are in that room." Wall absorbed that. "And Okafor?" "Neurosurg concern. We're managing it. The colonel at Callum is going to want a status report within the hour. Then I'll have something for you within the hour, but I need to be doing the work to have something to report." She looked at him directly. "Is there a different concern?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's going to be a joint review of today's response. Medical and military. Your name is going to be prominent in that review." She waited. "That's not a threat," he said. "I'm saying, whatever you're building in there, it's being noticed." She didn't know what to do with that in this particular moment, so she filed it in the same place she kept everything that didn't have an immediate operational use, and she said, "I'll be available for review after my patients are stable." And then she went back to work. Outside, the morning had become afternoon without anyone inside the hospital noticing. The sun had moved past its peak and was laying long, flat light across the parking lot, catching the windshields of the military vehicles and throwing bright rectangles against the hospital's exterior wall. Most of the emergency bay activity had quieted. The transport vehicles were repositioned, the Army medics were sitting on the bumper of the second truck drinking water, and the particular high-voltage energy that had flooded the bay 2 hours ago had settled into the slower, grinding tension of waiting. Dale Rourke had not left. He was parked at the edge of the staff lot, engine off, window down, watching. He told himself he was watching because he was waiting for Ashby to become available again, which was partially true. Ashby had sent out a message through the front desk, "Unavailable until further notice, we'll reschedule the meeting." And Rourke had decided that unavailable was not the same as unreachable, and that if he waited long enough, Ashby would have to come outside at some point. But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that something about the way the morning had unfolded was sitting wrong with him, and he didn't quite know what to do with that feeling, so he was doing what he'd always done with feelings he didn't understand. He was staying in place and waiting for them to make sense. He'd watched the military vehicles come in. He'd watched the controlled chaos of the emergency intake. He'd watched a woman in scrubs come through those bay doors 3 times in the space of an hour, each time moving with the specific efficiency of someone who knew where every second was going. He'd told himself that proves nothing. He told himself that now, sitting in his cruiser with the afternoon light on the windshield, and he almost believed it, his phone buzzed. "Sergeant Halverson? Where are you?" He typed back. "Marlowe General, following up on complaint." The response came after a pause that felt longer than it was. "Rourke. Come back to station." He stared at that for a moment. "The complaint is valid," he typed back. Another pause, longer this time. "Come back to station." He put the phone down. Victor Ashby was in his office on the 2nd floor with the door closed and the blinds angled down, and he was doing something he very rarely did. He was sitting without doing anything. His computer was on. His phone had 7 unread messages. The notification light on his desk set had been blinking for 20 minutes. He was ignoring all of it because he was thinking, and thinking was something he needed to do without the interruption of all the things that needed to be done. The morning had assembled itself in his mind into a sequence that he kept replaying. Sarah Voss in the parking lot. Badge visible, expression neutral. Standing exactly where she was supposed to be standing, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was showing up for a shift at the hospital where she worked. And he had looked at her and he had made a choice. Not because he thought Rourke was right, but because the calculation had run its familiar course. The cost of contradicting an officer against the cost of asking a staff member to take the side entrance, and the math had come out the way it always came out when he ran it. He'd added it up wrong. He knew that now. He'd known it, if he was honest. The moment Priya Nambiar had come through that door with exactly 0 patience for the situation. He'd known it watching Sarah walk past him without a word. But knowing something and doing something about it were different operations, and Ashby had spent 20 years in hospital administration learning to separate them. The problem was that the events of the afternoon had made separation difficult. He'd been in the corridor when the military transports came in. He'd seen Wall arrive. He'd seen the way Wall's eyes had gone straight to the trauma unit and then straight to Sarah, and the way that interaction had looked, not like an officer finding a staff member, but like a field commander confirming that command was accounted for. He'd heard the way Sarah had run that intake briefing. Short, exact, no hesitation, the kind of competence that was almost physical to be around. And he'd thought, I almost kept her out of this building this morning. He hadn't kept her out. Priya had made sure of that. But he hadn't stopped Rourke either, which meant that in the space between those 2 outcomes, he had made himself complicit in something that, if it were written down and reviewed, would look very bad. Not against policy exactly, because policy was flexible in the ways that benefited the institution, but against sense, against decency, against the basic logic of his own job, which was to keep the hospital running. And which category did blocking your trauma coordinator from the building before a mass casualty event fall into? Exactly. He picked up his phone. Then he put it down. Then he picked it up again and called his legal counsel, which was not the call he should have made first, but was the call his institutional instinct made automatically. And then, while it was ringing, he thought about how Sarah Voss had looked at him in the corridor this morning. Not with anger, which he could have handled, but with clarity. With the specific clarity of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had simply decided it wasn't worth her breath to name it. He ended the call before it connected. He sat there another moment. Then he opened his email and began typing. The CT came back on Okafor at 1:47, and it was not good news. The bleed had expanded, not catastrophically, but enough. Enough to mean that if Calloway arrived in the next 12 minutes and they went in within the next 30, they were probably looking at full recovery. If they waited another hour, the calculus changed in ways that Sarah didn't want to calculate. Marcus pulled up the images side by side the way she'd asked, and she stood at the light board with him, and they looked at it together. The first scan, intake, and the second, current. And the difference between them was quiet and terrible the way medical imaging always was. No drama in it, just a mass of shadow in a place where there shouldn't be shadow, and then more shadow. "Call Calloway again," she said. "Tell him we're not waiting at 20 minutes. Tell him 18. And if he's not here at 18, I'm calling the neuro attending directly." "The attending is in a procedure." "Then Interrupt the procedure. She looked at Marcus, who was 28 years old and learning very fast today. This is the moment where you make the call that feels too big to make. Make it. He made the call. Calloway arrived at 14:02. He was a neurosurgeon of the particular species that forms in high-pressure academic environments. Brilliant, abrasive, convinced of his own necessity in a way that was largely justified by outcome data. He came through the door of Bay 4 reviewing the imaging on his tablet, looked at Okafor, looked at the imaging again, and then looked at Sarah with an expression she recognized as the one surgeons use when they're impressed but don't feel like saying so. "Who made the call for the second CT?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Good call." He moved to the gurney. "Where's OR3? "Ready? Then let's go." Tom found her at 2:15 standing outside the staff bathroom off the trauma corridor, which was where she went when she needed 30 seconds of a space that wasn't in motion. She had her back against the wall and her eyes closed and her coffee, the replacement cup, now cold, held in both hands. She looked like a person who'd been awake for 30 continuous hours, except she hadn't been. She'd just been awake intensely for the past several hours, which did the same thing to a face. "Cortez is out of surgery," Tom said. She opened her eyes. "Stable. Surgeon says full recovery is probable." He paused. "Okafor's in OR3. Calloway says 90 minutes. She nodded. "The rest of the Fort Callum casualties are all stable or treated. Walking wounded are being cleared for transfer back to the base." He looked at her with the care of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that the person who holds everything together is also the person who most needs someone to check on them. "You should eat something. In a minute. You said that an hour ago." "I meant it then, too." He almost smiled. "There's another thing." She waited. "Ashby wants to meet with you. Today." Tom's voice stayed neutral in the specific way that meant he'd heard something he was choosing to present without editorializing. "He came down here about 20 minutes ago, but I told him you were with a patient, which was true. He said he'll wait." She was quiet for a moment. "Rourke's still out there?" she asked. "As of 40 minutes ago, yes." She turned the cold coffee cup in her hands. "I'm not going to talk to Ashby today. I'm going to finish my shift, make sure my patients are stable, give Captain Wall his status report, and then go home." She looked at Tom. "If Ashby wants to talk, he can put it in writing." Tom absorbed this. "Rourke filed the complaint with the department, not just administration. I heard it from Kelsey, who heard it from the front desk." "I know. So there's an official record now." "There's also 11 minutes and 43 seconds of entrance camera footage." She looked at Tom steadily. "Has Ashby seen it?" Something moved across Tom's face. "I don't know." "Someone in security has." She pushed off from the wall. "It's not going away. He knows that. That's why he wants to meet today." She dropped the coffee in the hallway trash. "But I'm not doing his paperwork for him." She went back to the unit. Sit. At 2:49, Captain Wall found her at the nurse's station writing notes. He stood at the end of the station and waited until she looked up, which she did after finishing her sentence, because she'd long ago decided that the urgency someone else projected onto a situation was not automatically her urgency. "Status," he said. "Cortez is post-surgical, stable, probable full recovery." She put down her pen. "Okafor is in surgery, neurosurg, 90 minutes from about 40 minutes ago. Prognosis is good if Calloway is as good as he thinks he is, which the data suggests he is. Your other three are stable and your walking wounded are cleared. The one with the radius fracture will need follow-up ortho in 3 days." Wall looked at her for a long moment. "The colonel is going to want to commend the response team." "That's generous." "It's accurate." He paused. "There's going to be an inquiry. Fort Callum, formal. We're required to do a full after-action review of today's incident, the accident, the casualty response, the coordination with civilian medical." He paused. "Your role in this response will be documented in detail." She wasn't sure what he wanted her to say to that. "The colonel also asked me," Wall continued, "to ask whether you have any prior military connection to Fort Callum's medical coordination unit, because your response protocol was—" He stopped. started again. It matched our internal emergency medicine framework more precisely than any civilian trauma coordinator we've worked with. She picked up her pen again. I was attached to Rapid Response Evac for 4 years. Which unit? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Something changed in his face. Not surprise, but recalibration. The kind that happens when information arrives and slots into a space that was already shaped for it. That unit coordinated with Callum twice, he said. About 6 years ago. I know. Were you? I was a medic, not in a command role at that point. She looked at him. But yes. Another silence. Outside, through the window at the end of the corridor, the sun was lower now. Mid-afternoon, the light going golden and long. The military transport vehicles were still in the bay, parked and quiet. I'll note that in the review, Wall said. She nodded once. He didn't leave immediately. He stood there another moment in the way people stand when they have something to add that isn't operational. Then he said, There's word that you had difficulty getting into the building this morning. She looked up at him. My medic saw it from the transport, said an officer was blocking the entrance. Wall's voice was level, but his eyes weren't. That true? She held his gaze for a moment. It's documented. How documented? Camera footage, audio, time-stamped. He was quiet for a count of 3. Anyone injured? No. Anyone prevented from responding to the casualty call? She thought about that. Technically, she'd gotten inside. Priya had made sure of that. But there had been a window, a real window, where Rourke's interference could have delayed her by enough minutes to matter. 40 minutes was not a forgiving margin in a multi-critical intake. No, she said, but it was closer than it should have been. Wall processed that. I'll include an addendum in the after-action review. You don't have to. Yes, I do. It wasn't aggressive. It was flat and certain. If a civilian law enforcement officer blocked access to a civilian facility that our personnel depend on in a medical emergency, that's a coordination failure. The Army takes coordination failures seriously. He looked at her directly, even retroactively. She heard what he wasn't saying. She heard the weight of it. Thank you, she said. He nodded and left. At 3:30, Okafor came out of surgery. Calloway delivered the news in the hallway outside OR3 with the unshowy economy of a surgeon who'd done many good outcomes and had learned not to oversell them. The bleed was evacuated. No structural damage that he could see. The next 24 hours would tell them more. But his clinical expectation was that Okafor would be eating breakfast tomorrow. Marcus, who had been hovering in the hallway for 40 minutes, let out a breath so long that it almost sounded like something breaking. Sarah put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Good call on the CT. He looked at her. You told me to order it. You made the call to Calloway. She moved her hand. That was yours. He stood up slightly straighter, which she noticed and didn't comment on. She went to find Tom to update the board, and then she was going to do what she'd told him she was going to do, finish the shift, give Wall his final report, and go home. What she was not going to do was visit Ashby's office, or stand in another administrative conversation about an incident that was already documented in sufficient detail to speak for itself. She was 3 steps from the nurse's station when Tom came around the corner from the other direction, moving with the specific purposefulness that meant something had happened that wasn't on the schedule. What? She said. Rourke's inside. She stopped. He came through the main entrance about 8 minutes ago, asked to speak with Ashby. Tom's expression was careful. Ashby's assistant told him Ashby was in a meeting. Rourke said he'd wait. He's been sitting in the administrative lobby for... Tom checked his watch. 7 minutes. She looked at Tom. Security saw him come in, Tom said. They flagged it to me because of this morning. Is he entitled to be here? As a member of the public? Yes. A pause. As an officer with no current active call at this location? That's a grayer question. She processed this. A cop who'd filed a complaint against a staff member at a hospital was now sitting in the administrative lobby of that hospital waiting for the administrator. On the same day. During the same shift where that staff member had just coordinated a mass casualty response. She thought about the footage on the server. She thought about Wall's addendum in the after-action review. She thought about the word documented and the many ways documentation functioned, and the specific irony that the same instinct that made Rourke file a formal complaint against her, the instinct to put things on record, to build a case, to establish a position before a conversation happened, was the same instinct that had caused the hospital security system to flag and save and timestamp everything that had happened this morning. "I need to talk to Dr. Nambiar," she said. "She's in her office." "Okay." She didn't move immediately. She stood there looking at the middle distance for a moment, in the specific way she stood when she was doing several things at once inside her own head. "Sarah," Tom said. She looked at him. "Whatever happens next, you did good work today." He said it plainly, without performance. "People are alive because you were in that building." She nodded, because it was true, and because it mattered, and because she didn't have any words right now that felt equal to it. Then she went to find Priya. Priya's office was small and stacked with paper, a fact that always surprised people who expected a chief of emergency medicine to be maximally digital. But Priya had a specific and unchangeable relationship with physical paper that had something to do with her training years and something to do with the fact that computers failed in ways that printed protocol sheets did not. There were plants on the windowsill, 3 of them, growing at angles toward the light in the specific way of things that don't get watered on a regular schedule, but survive anyway. Priya was on the phone when Sarah knocked. She held up one finger and finished the call in 30 seconds and then gestured at the chair across from her desk. Sarah sat. "Wall called me," Priya said before Sarah could start. "He wants the after-action medical report on his desk by Friday." "I'll have it." He also mentioned his addendum. "I know." Priya leaned back in her chair. She had the kind of stillness that experienced people develop, not in action, just the ability to be fully present without generating noise. "How are you feeling? About today generally, or about Rourke specifically?" "Either." Sarah thought about how to answer that honestly. "The work was good," she said. "The rest of it is—" She paused. "I'm not sure what it is yet." "It's a pattern," Priya said. "It wasn't a judgment, it was a diagnosis. Rourke does this. Administration allows it. Staff absorbs it." She looked at Sarah directly. "You're not the first person he's done this to. You're just the first person he did it to on a day when it could be demonstrated clearly and publicly how much it mattered." Sarah held her gaze. "And if today had been a normal shift?" Priya was quiet for a moment. "Then we'd be having the same conversation we've had 3 times before," she said, "about whether the footage is sufficient, about institutional relationships, about—" She stopped herself. Something moved across her face that was complicated and honest. "I've failed people on this before. I want you to know that I know that." Sarah didn't say anything. "Ashby is going to come to me," Priya said, "tonight or tomorrow morning. He's going to want to know how to manage this, and by manage, he's going to mean minimize. I want to know what you want before that conversation happens." Sarah looked at the plants on the windowsill. The one on the far left was almost entirely sideways, growing perpendicular toward the glass, doing what it needed to do to get to the light. "I want it documented," she said, formally. "Rourke's behavior this morning, the footage, Wall's addendum, all of it in my personnel file and in the incident record. Not as a complaint, just as a record." She looked back at Priya. "And I want it on record that he filed a complaint against me after the incident, while sitting in the administrative lobby of this hospital during my shift." "That's a reasonable request." "It's all I'm asking for." Priya nodded slowly. "It might not stay at that level," she said carefully. "The after-action review has a reach we can't entirely control. If Wall's addendum goes up the chain, I know. And the department will respond to that. I know that too." Priya looked at her the way she'd looked at her once before, early in Sarah's time here, when Sarah had caught a medication error that had been building for 3 days, the kind of error that only gets caught by someone paying a particular kind of attention, and afterward Priya had stood in the corridor and looked at her with that same expression, like the confirmation of something. "You're not going to push for more than that?" Priya asked. "Rourke filed a complaint against you for a confrontation he created. The footage will answer the complaint." Sarah stood up. "I don't need to fight the same battle twice." She was at the door when Priya said, "Sarah." She turned. Cortez's surgeon called me, Priya said. He wanted to make sure I knew who made the intake call. Sarah waited. He said whoever triage coordinated that intake understood field trauma at a level that he doesn't see in civilian coordinators. Priya paused. He wanted her noted. The light from the window was going amber now, late afternoon pressing toward early evening. Down the hall, somewhere, a monitor alarmed briefly and then stopped. I'll note it, Priya said quietly. Sarah went back to the unit. She had 2 patients to check on, a final status report to write, and a shift that ended in 40 minutes. She moved through the corridor with her head down and her mind still running the day. Cortez, Okafor, Marcus's good call, Wall's careful words in the hallway. And she was almost at the nurse's station when she rounded the corner and stopped. Because Dale Rourke was standing at the end of the corridor. He was in full uniform, hat in his hand, and he was not on the phone and he was not talking to anyone. He was standing still, which was somehow worse than all the versions of him that had been moving. He was looking at the bay windows, through which the military transports were visible, golden and large in the afternoon light. He must have come down from administration. He must have been told Ashby was unavailable. He was standing in a hospital corridor where he had no operational reason to be, holding his hat, looking out at the vehicles that had arrived because a mass casualty event required a trauma coordinator, and the trauma coordinator had been the woman he'd kept in the parking lot that morning. He didn't see her yet. She stood there for a moment, not hiding, not calculating, just registering the situation with the same level readiness she brought to everything. And then her pager went off. The number on the screen was the ICU. She looked at it, and something went cold in her chest, because the only reason the ICU paged trauma coordination directly was if she was already moving before the thought finished. The ICU was on the 4th floor, and the elevator was slow, so she took the stairs. She was through the stairwell door and moving up before she'd fully processed what she was doing, her shoes hitting the concrete steps in a rhythm that matched her thinking, fast, forward, no looking back. The pager had shown the ICU extension and a single flag code, 77. Not a standard alert, not a routine check-in. 77 was the code the ICU used when a patient was in acute deterioration and the attending needed a second clinical opinion immediately, and it was the code they sent to trauma coordination specifically when the deteriorating patient had come through trauma intake within the last 12 hours. Cortez. That was the only name it could be. She came through the ICU doors at a pace that made the charge nurse look up immediately. Bay 6, the nurse said, already pointing. She went. The ICU at Marlow General was a 16-bed unit arranged in a horseshoe around a central monitoring station, and Bay 6 was at the far end of the left wing, a corner space with 2 windows and more equipment than most bays, because it was where they put the highest acuity patients. Cortez was in Bay 6 because after vascular surgery on a femoral bleed, a 23-year-old in a body that had lost a significant percentage of its blood volume and then had it partially replaced was not a patient you put somewhere easy to ignore. She came around the curtain, and the attending, Dr. Felicia Lund, a compact woman in her mid-40s who wore her competence like practical clothing, looked up from the monitor with an expression that was controlled but tight at the edges. Pressure dropped, Lund said without preamble. 20 minutes ago, stable. Now, look. Sarah looked at the monitor. Systolic was at 81 and trending down. Heart rate elevated. The specific signature of a patient whose body was quietly losing a battle it had seemed to be winning. Post-surgical bleed? Sarah asked. Possibly. I've got a call into the vascular surgeon, but he's 20 minutes out. I need eyes on the imaging before I decide whether this goes back to the OR. Lund's voice was steady, but there was a fraction of something underneath it. Not panic, because Lund didn't panic, but the particular tension of a clinician who knows they're making a time-sensitive decision without all the information they want. You ran his intake. What was his volume status when you handed off? Sarah pulled it from memory without hesitating. 2 units packed red cells in transit. 1 unit fresh frozen plasma on intake. Pressure was borderline on arrival, stabilized with resuscitation before surgery. Surgeon noted the repair was technically clean. She looked at the monitor again. What's his urine output? 30 mils in the last hour. That was low. Low enough to mean the kidneys were not getting the perfusion they needed, which meant the whole system was under more pressure than the numbers had suggested an hour ago. "Get me the post-op imaging," Sarah said, "and call the vascular surgeon back. Not in 20 minutes, now. Tell him we may have an anastomotic issue." Lund was already moving. "That's my read, too." Cortez was conscious. Barely. His eyes were open and tracking, and he looked like someone who was fighting very hard to stay in a conversation his body was trying to end. He was 23 and he had a mother somewhere, probably, and friends from basic training who didn't know yet that today had been this kind of day for him. And none of that was relevant to what needed to happen in the next 10 minutes. But all of it was real. And Sarah held it in the part of her that held those things and worked in the part of her that worked. "Cortez." She moved into his sightline. "I'm Voss. I was with you at intake. Can you tell me if you're in pain?" His lips moved. "Stomach." It came out rough, barely shaped. "Something's wrong." "I know. We're fixing it." She looked at Lund. "He's symptomatic." "I see it." The post-op imaging came up on the bay monitor in the next 4 minutes, fast, because Lund had already cued it. They looked at it together side by side at the monitor, and Sarah saw it at the same moment Lund did because it wasn't subtle once you were looking for it. A faint hyperdensity near the repair site, small enough to miss if you weren't suspicious, large enough to mean that the anastomosis, the surgical connection the vascular surgeon had made to close the vessel, was leaking. Not fast, not catastrophic yet, but leaking. "He goes back," Sarah said. "Agreed." Lund was already on the phone. "Get me OR1, emergent. I need it in 10 minutes. The vascular surgeon, Dr. Mehran, arrived in 8. He came through the ICU doors at a pace that told Sarah he'd understood the call, reviewed the imaging remotely, and had already made the same calculation. He was a thin man in his 60s who moved like someone younger and had hands that were preternaturally still even when the rest of him was in motion, the specific stillness of a surgeon who had trained his body to save its precision for the moments that mattered. He looked at the monitor, looked at the imaging, looked at Cortez. "When did the pressure start dropping?" 22 minutes ago, Lund said. He looked at Sarah. "You caught it." Lund caught it. He moved past the semantics. "Or 1. "Ready in 6 minutes, Lund said. 4, he said. "Let's go." They moved. And Sarah moved with them because that was her role. Coordination didn't end at the OR door. It ended when the patient was stable and the team had everything it needed. And she was in the corridor outside OR1, helping the scrub nurse confirm the instrument count when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She pulled it out. "Tom." She stepped to the corridor wall and answered. "What?" "There's a situation in administration." Tom's voice had the careful quality he used when he was relaying information he hadn't fully processed yet. "Rourke, he's..." A pause. "He's not leaving." She looked at the OR door. Inside, Mehran was already scrubbing. "What do you mean he's not leaving?" "He went to Ashby's office. Ashby's assistant told him Ashby was gone for the day, which is apparently not true. Ashby is still in his office with the door locked, and Rourke said he wasn't leaving until he filed the complaint in person." Another pause. "He's been up there for 25 minutes. He's not aggressive. He's just sitting in the hallway outside Ashby's office and refusing to move." She processed this. "Has anyone called the department?" "Halverson called here. Looking for Rourke." And the front desk put the call through to security, who told Halverson that an officer was on the premises in an administrative capacity and there was no current concern. Tom paused. Halverson did not sound satisfied with that answer. She looked down the corridor. Through the window at the end, the sky was doing the last thing it did before dark. A deep pressed blue that was almost purple. The mountains in the distance reduced to silhouettes. The shift had been supposed to end 40 minutes ago. "I can't deal with this right now," she said. "Cortez is back in surgery." A silence. "Tom, I'm here. Is anyone at risk?" "No." He said it with certainty. "Rourke's just sitting there. He's angry, I think, but he's not doing anything." Then let him sit. She put the phone away. She turned back to the OR. What she didn't know, what nobody in the hospital knew yet, because it had happened in the last 40 minutes while the building was focused on other things, was that Wall's after-action communication had already gone up the Fort Callum chain of command. Not the full review, that would take days, but the initial incident report, which Wall had filed from his vehicle in the parking lot using the Army's secure communications system, and which had included a factual, 3-paragraph addendum about access obstruction at the civilian medical facility. That report had reached the Fort Callum commander. The Fort Callum commander had read the addendum and had then made a phone call to his counterpart in the Montana National Guard's liaison office, who had a relationship with the Crestfall County Sheriff's Department, which oversaw and reviewed municipal police operations under a shared services agreement that most people in Crestfall had forgotten existed because it rarely got activated. The call was 11 minutes long. At the end of it, the liaison officer had written down 3 things: Rourke, D. Crestfall. PD, Marlow. General entrance, Thursday. Camera footage. Formal review. That piece of paper was on a desk in an office building 4 miles from the hospital. It would still be there in the morning. Or one took 51 minutes. Miron came out at 6:47 with the specific expression of a surgeon who had gone back in and fixed what was wrong and knew it. Not triumphant. Surgeons who'd done this long enough didn't do triumphant, but settled. The way a craftsman looks when a second attempt has corrected the first. Clean repair, he said. The anastomosis had a small technical failure at the distal end. Not unusual with the degree of trauma on presentation. It's addressed. He looked at Sarah. He'll need close monitoring for 24 hours, but he's going to be fine. She nodded. The timing mattered, Miron said. He said it the way he'd said it once before, not giving credit exactly, but marking a fact. If that bleed had gone another 30 minutes undetected, Lund caught it early. He gave her a look that said he'd also noticed who was standing in the ICU when the call was made. He didn't argue with her attribution. He just said, "Good response team," and went to write his notes. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The building was quieter now. The shift had turned over. New faces at the nurses' station. The overnight energy beginning to settle into the particular vigilance of nighttime emergency medicine. The military transport vehicles were still in the bay. She could see them through the window at the end of the hall, lit by the bay floodlights in the dark. She thought about Cortez. She thought about Okafor eating breakfast tomorrow. She thought about Marcus learning something today that would make him a better doctor for the rest of his career. She thought about the footage on the server. She thought about Rourke sitting in the hallway outside Ashby's locked office. She thought about the word documented and the way Wall had said it and the piece of paper she didn't know about 4 miles away. And then her phone rang. Not her pager. Her personal phone. The one that she kept on silent during shifts, and that only went off for calls she'd pre-authorized, which was a very short list. She looked at the screen. The number wasn't in her contacts. The area code was from Washington, D.C. She stood in the corridor, phone in hand, for a full second, which was long enough, given everything she knew about who had her number and who didn't, to understand that something had just changed in a way she hadn't seen coming. She answered. "Voss," she said. The voice on the other end was a man's voice, measured and deliberate, with the specific cadence of someone who'd spent years in institutions where words carried operational weight. "Ms. Voss," he said. "My name is Colonel Raymond Pace. I'm calling from the office of the Army Surgeon General." A pause. "I've been reviewing Captain Wall's incident report from Fort Callum. I have a few questions about this morning, if you have a moment." She looked at the OR door. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the military vehicles in the dark below. "Yes," she said. "I have a moment." "Good." Another pause. "I want to start with the access obstruction. Captain Wall's report indicates you were detained outside the facility for approximately 11 minutes by a local law enforcement officer with no cause documented and no incident resolved prior to the mass casualty event." His voice was careful, not angry. The kind of careful that was worse than anger. "I want to understand exactly what happened, and I want to understand whether the officer in question is currently still on the premises." She was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said. "He is." A silence on the other end that felt like something being decided. "Ms. Voss," Colonel Pace said, "I need you to stay available for the next 30 minutes. I'm making a second call." The line stayed open. Downstairs, in the administrative corridor outside Victor Ashby's locked office, Dale Rourke was sitting in a plastic chair with his hat on his knee, and he had no idea that a phone in a corridor 1 floor above him had just connected to Washington, D.C., and that the next call Colonel Pace was going to make was to the Crestfall County Sheriff. She stayed on the line for 4 minutes. Colonel Pace asked his questions the way military investigators ask questions, not building to anything dramatic, just establishing a factual record with the efficiency of someone who already knew most of the answers and was confirming the gaps. He asked about the timeline. He asked about the duration of the obstruction. He asked whether she had been given any reason for the detention. He asked whether the obstruction had affected her ability to prepare for the mass casualty intake. She answered everything the same way she'd answered Wall, accurately, without inflation, without minimizing. She described what had happened in the same sequence it had happened, and when Pace asked about Ashby's role, she described that too, plainly. And when he asked if there were witnesses, she told him about the orderly, the overnight nurses, the visitor with the coffee cup, and the 11 minutes and 43 seconds on the entrance camera. When she was done, he said, "Thank you, Ms. Voss. I'll be in contact through Captain Wall." And then the line went quiet. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she called Tom. "Is Rourke still in the building?" "As of 5 minutes ago, yes. I'm coming down." Sarah, not to talk to him. She was already moving toward the stairs. "I want to be on that floor when whatever happens next happens. I'm not going to be somewhere else in this building while it plays out." Tom was quiet for a moment. "What's about to happen?" "I don't know exactly," she said, "but something." She took the stairs down. The administrative corridor on the second floor had the specific quiet of a building winding down. Lights at half intensity, offices dark behind frosted glass, the hum of the ventilation system filling the space where daytime noise had been. Ashby's office was at the far end, past the HR suite and the conference room that smelled permanently of old coffee. Rourke was still in the chair. He had his hat in both hands now, turning it by the brim in a slow rotation that looked unconscious, a body doing something while the mind was somewhere else. He'd been sitting for close to an hour. His uniform was still correct, still professional, but there was something in the way he was positioned, shoulders lower, back not quite straight, that read differently than it had this morning. He looked up when Sarah came around the corner. They looked at each other. She didn't stop walking. She wasn't heading for him. She was heading for the chair on the other side of the hallway, the one outside the HR office, which was dark and empty. She sat down in it. He watched her do this. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." He turned the hat another half rotation. "I have a complaint to file." "I know. I heard." She looked at him across the corridor. He was maybe 12 feet away. "You filed it with the department already. In person is different." She didn't argue with that. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the wall and let the silence exist without trying to fill it. After about 30 seconds, Rourke said, "What were you doing in that corridor?" "Waiting." "For what?" "I don't know yet." He was quiet. The hat rotated. She watched his face from 12 feet away, not studying it, just looking at it. And what she saw was a man who had come here to win an argument and had spent the last several hours watching evidence accumulate against him in real time, and didn't quite know what to do with that except stay in the chair. "I was doing my job this morning," he said. It didn't come out like a statement. It came out like something he was trying to convince himself of. She didn't respond. "People use that entrance without authorization. It's happened." "I had my badge," she said. Not aggressive, just a fact. "Badges can be..." "My badge has a QR code linked to the hospital credentialing system." She looked at him directly. "You could have scanned it with your phone. That would have taken less time than any of this." He was quiet. "I know," he said. It was very quiet, She wasn't sure she was meant to hear it. Before she could respond to that, before she could decide whether to respond at all, the elevator at the end of the corridor opened. She looked up. Sergeant Glenn Halverson of the Crestfall Police Department was not a large man, but he walked like one, heavy, through the shoulders, deliberate, the specific gait of someone who had been doing this job for a long time and had developed the physical posture of institutional authority. He was in his 50s, silver at the temples, with a face that had been arranged into neutral professionalism, but was doing a lot of work to stay there. He wasn't alone. Beside him was a man Sarah didn't recognize. Mid-50s, civilian clothes, a jacket that said Crestfall County Sheriff's Office across the back. Behind him was Priya Nambiar, who was walking at the same pace as the other two and whose expression was entirely unreadable. Halverson saw Rourke immediately. "Dale." His voice was contained. "Let's go." Rourke stood. The hat stopped rotating. "I'm in the middle of, let's go." Halverson said it again with the same volume and none of the patience. He looked at the sheriff's representative and then looked at Rourke again. And in that look was a communication that didn't need words. "You don't understand how far up this has gone yet, but you're about to." Rourke looked at Sarah. She met his eyes and held them, and she didn't put anything in her expression. Not satisfaction, not anger, not the vindication that was sitting somewhere in her chest and needed somewhere to be. She just looked at him the way she'd looked at him all day, straight on, without flinching, without noise. He put his hat on. He walked to Halverson. The three of them went to the elevator. When the doors closed, the hallway was very quiet. Priya walked to where Sarah was sitting and stood beside her. "Pace called the sheriff's liaison office," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Halverson got a call 20 minutes ago." Priya paused. "The sheriff's office is opening a separate review, independent of Rourke's department." Sarah looked at the elevator doors. "Victor is going to need to open that office," Priya said. "I know." "Are you ready for that conversation?" She thought about Cortez in the ICU, stable now, his pressure holding. She thought about Okafor, who would eat breakfast tomorrow. She thought about Marcus standing straighter in the hallway outside the OR. She thought about 11 minutes and 43 seconds of footage on a server that nobody had deleted. "Yes," she said. Ashby's office door opened 3 minutes after the elevator took Rourke and Halverson to the ground floor. He must have heard the hallway go quiet. He must have heard the elevator. He came out looking the way he'd looked all day, composed on the surface, doing arithmetic underneath, and when he saw Sarah and Priya both standing in his corridor, something in his composure shifted in a way that was almost physical. He looked at Priya first. "Dr. Nambiar." "Victor?" Priya's voice had the same quality it always had, informational. "We need to talk." "I know." He looked at Sarah. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite acknowledgement, but was the thing that comes before both, the thing that arrives when a person has been running a calculation long enough to understand it came out wrong. "Sarah, I owe you a meeting," she said. "That's all, right now." She wasn't cold about it, but she wasn't warm either. She was exactly what she'd been all day, present, direct, not interested in performance. The three of them went into Ashby's office. The meeting lasted 37 minutes. It was not comfortable. It was not a situation where everything resolved itself in the smooth narrative way of institutional reconciliation, where the person in power says the right words and the person who was wronged accepts them and the room reaches equilibrium. Real meetings don't work that way, and this one didn't. Ashby talked first, which was what he needed to do. And what he said was honest in the partial way of someone being honest under duress, accurate about the facts, careful around the self-assessment. He said he'd seen the footage. He said he'd known who Sarah was when he'd come outside that morning. He said the decision he'd made had been the wrong one. He said it without making it smaller than it was, which was the one thing he got right. Priya asked him about the complaint Rourke had filed and what the hospital's formal response would be. He said the hospital would not be supporting the complaint. He said that in writing, in an email he drafted while they sat there, which Priya read over his shoulder and had him revise once, Sarah said 3 things total in 37 minutes. She said she wanted the documentation she'd described to Priya, the formal record of the morning's incident and all subsequent related events in her personnel file. She said she wanted written confirmation that the hospital would cooperate fully with the sheriff's independent review. And she said, at the end, when Ashby looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to know if he'd done enough, "I'm not here to make this easier for you, Victor. I'm here to make sure it's documented correctly. That's all I can do." He nodded. He looked for the first time that day like someone who had a realistic view of where he was. Priya glanced at Sarah as they left and said nothing, which was the right response. The next 3 days moved the way the aftermath of things moves. Not dramatically, not in clear scenes, but in accumulation. The sheriff's independent review opened formally on Friday morning. 2 investigators requested and received the entrance camera footage by noon. By end of day Friday, they had signed statements from 4 witnesses: the orderly, one of the overnight nurses, the visitor who'd been standing at the entrance, and a hospital security staff member who'd been reviewing the footage when the incident was flagged. The review also formally requested Rourke's body camera footage from the morning, which Rourke's department was required to provide and did, after a delay of several hours that the investigators noted in their report. Rourke was placed on administrative leave pending review on Friday afternoon. Halverson made the notification by phone. Rourke didn't come in on Saturday. The Fort Callum after-action review was filed Sunday. It was 43 pages and covered the training accident, the casualty response, the medical coordination, and, in Wall's addendum, which ran to 6 paragraphs, the access obstruction. The addendum cited the entrance footage, the witness accounts, and the specific timeline showing that the obstruction had occurred in the 40-minute window before a mass casualty event requiring immediate trauma coordination. It used language that military documents use when they want something understood clearly without editorial comment: precise, passive, devastating. The addendum was forwarded, along with the full review, to 3 offices: Fort Callum Command, the Montana National Guard Liaison, and PES, at Colonel Pace's direction, the state law enforcement oversight body. By Sunday evening, 3 news outlets had received tips about an incident at Marlow General involving a police officer and a hospital staff member during a military casualty event. 2 of them had already submitted public records requests for the entrance footage. Ashby found out about the media inquiries on Monday morning and did something that surprised Priya when she heard about it later. Instead of routing the response through the hospital's public relations firm and releasing a statement that said as little as possible, he called the communications team into his office and told them to cooperate with the records request within the bounds of patient privacy law. He said it was the right thing to do. He said it in the specific tone of a person who had recently done the wrong thing and was trying to calibrate. Priya heard about this from the communications director and stood in her office for a moment looking at the wall. She didn't know what to do with a Victor Ashby who was trying. It was a different version of the problem than the one she'd been managing for 3 years. She filed it away and went back to work. Sarah's Monday started at 6:30. She checked Cortez first. ICU, Bay 6, pressure stable through the night, color returning, the specific improvement that comes when a body has been given back what it lost and is starting to believe it can use it again. He was awake when she came in, and he looked at her with the focused, uncertain gaze of someone who had been conscious for several hours and was still assembling the pieces of the past several days. "You were there," he said. "At the start." "Yes." "My surgeon said something about—" He stopped. His throat was still rough. "He said the timing was close." "It was managed," she said, not dismissing it, not dramatizing it, just the fact. He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you." She didn't know the right thing to say to that because she never did. Thank you was the hardest thing to receive in this job, because receiving it correctly required acknowledging that you'd been necessary in a way that meant things had gone badly enough to need you, and that was not a simple equation. So she did what she usually did, which was nod once and mean it and move on. Okafor was in a regular room on the 3rd floor, sitting up, eating from a breakfast tray with the determined appetite of a young man whose body had decided it was done, being a crisis, and was now processing eggs. He talked too much and moved too fast for someone who'd had brain surgery 48 hours ago, which was an excellent sign, and Sarah told him 3 times to slow down before she gave up and just made a note in his chart that someone else would enforce it. She went to the trauma unit. Tom was at the nurse's station. He looked at her the way he always did, reading whatever she was communicating without her having to communicate it explicitly. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Working," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the one I have." He handed her a chart. "Okay. A beat. For what it's worth." The overnight team was talking about Friday, about the response. He looked at the chart in his own hands, not at her. "People are—" He stopped. "People know what happened." She understood what he meant. Not just the clinical response, though that was part of it, but all of it. The parking lot, Rourke, the footage, the way the morning had been and the way the afternoon had been. The distance between those two things and what it said about where the work actually happened and why. "People knew before," she said. "Yeah." He looked up. "But now they're saying it out loud." On Tuesday, the Sheriff's Review Office sent a formal written request to Rourke's department asking for his full disciplinary history. It wasn't a public document, but these things moved in institutions the way water moves in buildings, through walls, around corners, appearing in places it wasn't supposed to be. By Tuesday afternoon, a name had surfaced in the review that changed the shape of the situation. The name was Tamara Whitfield. Whitfield was a 36-year-old phlebotomist who had worked at Marlowe General for 2 years before leaving for a position in Billings. 14 months ago, she had filed a complaint with hospital administration and the Crestfall Police Department after an incident at the hospital's south parking lot in which Rourke had questioned her credentials, followed her to her car, and, per her complaint, told her that she didn't look like hospital staff. The complaint had been reviewed by Rourke's department and found to be unsubstantiated. Hospital administration, Ashby's office, had sent Whitfield a letter acknowledging receipt of her complaint and noting that the matter had been resolved at the department level. The sheriff's investigator found this in Rourke's file. She also found 2 other complaints from different locations: a parking garage attendant, a grocery delivery driver, both minority individuals, both involving Rourke questioning their right to be somewhere, both resolved internally with no action taken. She put these in a folder with the entrance footage from Marlowe General and the body camera footage from Rourke's unit and a copy of Wall's addendum. The folder went to the oversight body. Nobody outside those offices knew about it yet. Sarah didn't know about Whitfield on Tuesday. She found out on Wednesday from Priya, who had been contacted by the sheriff's office asking whether the hospital had records of Whitfield's complaint. They were in Priya's office, and Priya told her, and Sarah sat with it for a moment, in the specific way she sat with things that needed sitting with. 14 months ago, she said. Yes. Ashby's office sent her a letter. Yes. Priya's voice was even. I didn't know about it at the time. I found out yesterday. What did the letter say? Priya was quiet for a moment. It said the matter had been addressed at the department level and the hospital considered the incident resolved. Sarah looked at the plants on the windowsill, the sideways one, still growing toward the glass. She left, Sarah said. 2 months after filing the complaint. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hospital ran. Monitors, footsteps, the distant sound of an overhead page. All the ordinary machinery of the place. This changes things, Sarah said, not as a question. It changes the scope of the review, Priya said carefully, and it changes what Victor has to answer for. She looked at Sarah. He's cooperating, but cooperating with something this size is different from cooperating with what he thought it was 3 days ago. Sarah sat with that. She thought about Whitfield in Billings, who had filed a complaint 14 months ago and received a letter that said, resolved, who had stayed 2 months and then left, who was probably, right now, going about a Tuesday somewhere without knowing that her complaint had found its way into a folder that was changing the shape of what happened to Dale Rourke. Does she know? Sarah asked. The investigator contacted her this morning. Sarah looked at the window. Good. Priya watched her for a moment. The oversight body is going to want your formal statement by end of week. I'll have it. Are you doing all right with all of this? Sarah thought about how to answer that honestly, which was the same calculation she made every time someone asked her that question, and she always landed in the same place. The true answer was complicated, and complicated wasn't what people needed from her professionally, and simplified wasn't accurate, so she said the thing that was the most honest, shortest version. "I'm doing the work," she said. "That's what I'm good at." Priya accepted that. She'd learned in 7 months of working with Sarah Voss that this was not deflection. It was a real answer about how a specific kind of person stays functional in the world. On Thursday, 1 week after the morning in the parking lot, the Crestfall Police Department released a statement saying that Officer Dale Rourke had been suspended with pay pending the outcome of a formal departmental review and an external investigation by the Crestfall County Sheriff's Office. The statement did not describe the nature of the review. It said the department took all complaints of officer misconduct seriously. It was 4 sentences. It appeared on the department's website at 9:17 in the morning. By 10, 2 of the 3 news outlets that had submitted records requests had received partial responses. By noon, one of them had the entrance footage. By 3, a reporter from the Crestfall Courier had contacted Marlowe General's communications office, asking for a response to a story they planned to run the following morning about an incident involving a staff member, a police officer, and a military mass casualty event. Ashby's communications director came to Priya first, not Ashby, which said something about how the internal hierarchy had quietly shifted in the past week. Priya came to Sarah. They were in the corridor outside the trauma unit, and Sarah had a chart in her hand and 12 minutes before she needed to be somewhere. "A story's running tomorrow," Priya said. "The Courier. They have the footage. They want a response from the hospital and from you, if you're willing." Sarah looked at the chart. "From me directly?" The reporter asked if you'd speak with her, off the record to start, to understand what happened. Whether it goes on the record is your call. Priya paused. "I want to be clear. You don't have to do anything. The documentation exists, the reviews are running. You don't need to give a statement to a reporter for any of this to proceed." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She thought about Whitfield, filing a complaint 14 months ago and receiving 4 sentences that said resolved, and then leaving. She thought about the 2 other complaints in Rourke's file that had been processed the same way, into folders, into archives, into the institutional mechanism that turned accountability into paperwork, and paperwork into silence. She thought about what I'll have it meant, and what documented meant, and the difference between a record that existed and a record that was seen. "I'll talk to her," she said. Priya nodded, the kind of nod that held things. Sarah went back to work. The Courier story ran Friday morning. It ran long, 1,400 words, above the fold in the digital edition, with the entrance footage embedded, time-stamped, and unedited. The headline read, "Hospital Trauma Coordinator Blocked at Entrance Before Fort Callum, Mass Casualty Response." The subhead read, "Officer Under Review, 3 prior complaints surface." The story named Rourke. It named the dates of the 3 prior complaints. It described Whitfield's case in a paragraph that was brief and factual, and because of that, impossible to look away from. It quoted the Army's after-action addendum verbatim on the access obstruction. It quoted Marlowe General's statement, which had been drafted by Ashby's communications team and which, notably, compared to the language Ashby's office had historically used for these things, did not describe the incident as resolved. The statement said, "Marlowe General takes seriously the events of last Thursday, including the role our administration played in how the situation unfolded. We are cooperating fully with all active reviews. We are committed to ensuring that every member of our staff has safe, unobstructed access to this facility." It did not say resolved. Priya read it at her desk at 7 in the morning and sat for a moment looking at it. Sarah read it on her phone in the staff lot at 6:40, standing beside her car in the cold morning air, and when she was done, she put her phone in her pocket and looked up at the hospital entrance. The automatic doors, the camera mounted above them, the ordinary industrial architecture of a place where people came when things went wrong. She picked up her bag. She walked to the entrance. The doors opened without obstruction. Inside, Tom was already at the nurse's station with coffee. Real coffee, from the pot someone brought from home. And he looked up when she came in and handed her a cup without saying anything, because he'd learned by now that she didn't need the commentary. She took the cup. She started her shift. At 7:42, while Sarah was in the trauma unit and the courier story was circulating on social media and the overnight desk sergeant at Crestfall PD was fielding the fourth call of the morning about Dale Rourke, Halverson walked into his own office and found a certified letter from the state law enforcement oversight body on his desk. The letter informed him that, pursuant to the active review of Officer Dale Rourke and the 3 prior complaints recently documented, the oversight body was expanding its inquiry to include a review of departmental handling of all 3 prior complaints, specifically the internal review processes that had resulted in findings of unsubstantiated in each case. Halverson read it twice. Then he sat down in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and thought about all the times, in the past 3 years, when someone had come to him about Rourke, and he had listened and calculated and concluded that the cost of a full investigation was higher than the cost of an informal resolution. He thought about what that calculation had built, slowly, quietly, across 14 months and 3 complaints and 1 morning in a hospital parking lot. He picked up the phone. The person he called was not Rourke. The person he called was the department's legal counsel. The call lasted 18 minutes. When it was over, Halverson opened his email and began drafting a memo to the oversight body confirming the department's full cooperation with the expanded review. And when he got to the line where he had to describe the prior internal processes and outcomes, he wrote 1 sentence and then deleted it and started again, because the first version was too defensive and the second version was closer to honest. And honest was what the moment required, even though honest was going to be complicated for a very long time. He was still writing when his desk phone rang. He looked at the display. It was Rourke. He let it ring. On the 4th ring, it went to voicemail. He went back to the memo. Outside, across town, in the Crestfall Courier's digital comments section, the entrance footage had been viewed 11,000 times in 3 hours, and a woman in Billings named Tamara Whitfield was sitting at her kitchen table with her phone in her hand, reading the story about Marlowe General, and she was not surprised by any of it. Not the footage, not the 3 complaints, not the word unsubstantiated, but she was something else. She was reading her own name, in print, in a story that said complaint, not allegation. That said 3 prior cases, not isolated incident. That said the reviews were ongoing and expanding, not resolved. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. She scrolled back to the top and read the story again from the beginning, slowly, and somewhere in the middle of the second read, she stopped on a paragraph about a woman named Sarah Voss, who had stood in a parking lot for 11 minutes and 43 seconds, and then spent the rest of her shift saving lives, and something in Whitfield's chest did something complicated that took her a moment to identify. It was the specific feeling of not being alone in something you'd been alone in for 14 months. And 4 miles across Crestfall, in an office that was starting to understand how small its walls were, Victor Ashby had just received a call from the hospital's board of directors requesting a formal meeting. Not later this week, not when schedules permitted, but tomorrow morning at 8, before rounds, before the public day started. And the tone of the call had been the tone of a board that had read the Courier story and the Army's addendum and understood that cooperating with reviews and committed to accountability were phrases that needed to be backed by something more than language, and that the something more was going to require decisions that Ashby had been avoiding for 3 years. He was still on the phone when his email loaded a new message. The sender was the State Hospital Regulatory Office. The subject line read, Marlowe General, request for administrative records, access protocols and incident documentation. He stared at it for a moment. Then he forwarded it to legal counsel without opening it, because opening it meant starting a clock, and he needed 30 more minutes to think about what he was going to say to the board tomorrow morning before that clock started running. The email sat in his sent folder with a timestamp of 8:04 a.m. In the regulatory office, an administrator logged its receipt at 8:06 and assigned it a case number. The case number was the 13th opened that month. It would not be the last thing opened because of what had happened at Marlowe General's entrance on a Thursday morning when a woman in scrubs had been stopped on her way to work. The board meeting started at 8 and ran until 10:47. Ashby came out of it with the particular posture of a man who had been in a room for nearly 3 hours and had spent most of that time answering questions he didn't have good answers to. Not because he'd been dishonest, he'd been, by his own account, more honest with the board than he'd been in any meeting in recent memory. but because honesty about a 3-year pattern of institutional avoidance doesn't produce clean answers. It produces more questions. It produces the kind of scrutiny that starts with one incident and opens backward through time, finding all the moments where a different decision could have been made and wasn't. The board requested 3 things by end of the following week: a complete audit of all prior staff complaints involving external personnel, a revised access and security protocol for the main entrance, and a written account of Ashby's specific role in the Rourke incident, including the decision not to confirm Sarah's identity that Thursday morning. The third request was the one that changed his face. Priya heard about the meeting from a board member she'd known for 11 years, who called her at 11:15 and said 3 sentences. It was serious. He's not being removed, but he's not the same man who walked in there this morning. She sat with that for a moment. Not removed. That would bother some people. It bothered a part of her, the part that had watched 3 years of complaints get smoothed into archives. But she'd been in institutions long enough to know that removal wasn't always the mechanism that produced change. Sometimes it was the sustained, uncomfortable weight of accountability that couldn't be delegated or deferred, the kind that required someone to sit in the thing they'd done and do the work of undoing it while everyone watched. She didn't know if Ashby was capable of that. She thought he might be trying to find out. The regulatory inquiry from the state office formally requested documents on a Tuesday. By Thursday of that same week, it had been joined by a parallel inquiry from the County Health Services Board, which had read the Courier story and the Fort Callum addendum and had questions about Marlowe General's emergency access protocols that went beyond the specific incident into systemic questions about how the hospital handled law enforcement presence during medical operations. These were not small inquiries. They had timelines and documentation requirements and legal counsel involved on both sides, and they would take months to fully resolve. But they were open, and they were public record, and that meant they existed in a way that internal reviews and 4-sentence letters never had. The Courier ran a follow-up piece on the Wednesday between those 2 weeks. This one was shorter, 800 words, and focused on Tamara Whitfield. It was the piece that Whitfield had not expected and had agreed to, after 2 days of thinking about it, because the reporter had called her in Billings and asked if she wanted to speak, and Whitfield had sat at her kitchen table for a long time before saying yes. She didn't say yes because she was angry, though she was. She said yes because 14 months ago she had said something and the institution had looked through her and she had left. And leaving had felt at the time like the only option and had felt, in retrospect, like a loss she'd never quite named. And now her name was in a story that used the word complaint instead of allegation and pattern, instead of isolated. And saying yes to the reporter felt like the thing she should have been able to do 14 months ago if the structure had been different. The Whitfield piece ran with one photograph, her, at her kitchen table, hands around a coffee mug, looking at the camera with an expression that was not performing anything, just a person who had something to say and was saying it. The story got shared 4,000 times in the first hour. Sarah read the Whitfield piece on her lunch break, on her phone, in the small break room off the trauma corridor that smelled like someone's reheated leftovers and the specific institutional coffee she'd stopped trying to avoid. She read it once. Then she put the phone face down on the table and looked at the wall. She thought about the word left. She thought about what it took to leave somewhere and what it took to stay, and the difference between those two choices, not in terms of courage, because both required a kind of courage that looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside, but in terms of cost. Whitfield had paid one cost. Sarah had paid a different one. Neither of them had chosen their cost freely. The costs had been assigned by a system that had decided, before either of them arrived, how much their discomfort was worth. She picked the phone back up. She found Whitfield's name in the article and the contact information the reporter had included, a professional email, Whitfield's choice, her way of saying, "I'm reachable, but on my terms." And Sarah opened her email and typed 4 sentences. She introduced herself. She said she'd read the piece. She said she was glad Whitfield had spoken. She said, in the last sentence, that if Whitfield ever wanted to talk to someone who'd been in a version of the same room, she was available. She sent it before she could decide not to. Then she ate her lunch and went back to work. Dale Rourke resigned from the Crestfall Police Department on a Friday, 3 weeks after the morning in the parking lot. He did not hold a press conference. He did not issue a statement. The department released 4 sentences, notably similar in length and tone to the letter Whitfield had received 14 months earlier, which was either irony or bureaucratic inevitability, saying that Officer Rourke had submitted his resignation effective immediately and that the external review would continue regardless of his employment status. The review did continue. 6 weeks after his resignation, the state oversight body released its findings. The report was 41 pages and examined Rourke's conduct across the 3 prior complaints and the Marlow General incident. Its conclusions were specific and documented, a pattern of targeted identity challenges against individuals of color in professional settings, departmental review processes that had failed to apply consistent standards across complaint types, and supervisory decisions. Halverson was named, that had prioritized institutional cohesion over accountability in each of the 3 prior cases. The report recommended that Rourke be barred from law enforcement certification in the state of Montana. It recommended that Halverson receive a formal reprimand and be required to complete bias and supervision training before returning to any supervisory role. It recommended that the Crestfall PD implement mandatory external review for all complaints involving access challenges at medical, educational, or other public service facilities. The recommendations were not binding, but they were published. And published recommendations, in an era when 4,000 people share a story in an hour, have a different kind of weight than they used to. Rourke's certification was ultimately suspended pending further review, a process that moved slowly, the way these processes always moved, and that would take another 4 months to reach a final determination. But suspended was not the same as unsubstantiated. Suspended meant stopped. It meant the credential that defined his professional identity was in a room with a locked door that he no longer had a key to. He moved out of Crestfall 6 weeks after his resignation. Nobody at Marlow General knew where he went. Nobody asked. Ashby's board-mandated audit of prior complaints found 7 cases over 5 years involving external personnel, police, contractors, vendor representatives, where staff complaints had been routed through a process that consistently resulted in findings favorable to the external party. 6 of the 7 complainants were women. 5 of the 7 were people of color. All 7 complaints had been resolved through internal review with no external oversight. The audit report sat on Ashby's desk for 2 days before he sent it to the board. On the 3rd day, he walked to Priya's office and knocked on the open door. She looked up. He came in and sat down across from her. Not in the way he usually used that chair, which was the chair of an administrator managing a subordinate's concerns, but in the way a person sits when they've put something down that they've been carrying and can feel how heavy it was. "I'm going to recommend a third-party ombudsman position," he said. "Independent of administration, reports to the board directly on staff complaints involving external parties." He paused. "It won't fix what was already broken, but it's the mechanism that should have existed." Priya looked at him steadily. "What made you decide that?" He was quiet for a moment. "I read the audit." Another pause. "I knew most of those cases. I remembered them, and reading them in sequence, all 7 of them, it looked different than any single one of them looked at the time." He looked at his hands briefly. "At the time, they all looked manageable. In sequence, they looked like a system." She didn't tell him he was right. He knew he was right. What he needed wasn't validation, it was someone who would hold the standard going forward, and that was a different kind of response. "The ombudsman position is a start," she said. "I know it's a start. The 7 cases need individual follow-up, letters at minimum, personal contact where the person is reachable." "I know." "Whitfield specifically." He nodded. "I'm writing that one myself." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes the full measure of something without announcing what it finds. "Okay," she said. He stood up. He was at the door when she said his name, and he turned. "It matters that you're doing this," she said. Not warmly, not as reassurance. As a fact, presented the same way she presented all facts, straight and undecorated. "It doesn't erase the 7 cases, but it matters." He nodded once. He left. She sat with the residue of the conversation for a moment, the complicated thing that happens when a person you've been angry at for 3 years starts doing what they should have been doing, and you have to recalibrate your anger without discarding it. Because the anger was right, and the accountability is also right, And those two things don't cancel each other out. They coexist. That's the unglamorous reality of institutional change. It happens next to the damage it's correcting, not after it, and you have to hold both at the same time and keep working. She went back to her notes. The Fort Callum formal commendation arrived on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the mass casualty event. It came as a physical document, an official Army citation, delivered through Captain Wall, who brought it to Marlowe General in person and handed it to Priya, who walked it to the trauma unit and found Sarah reviewing post-op notes at the nurses' station. Priya set the document on the counter beside her. Sarah looked at it, then looked at Priya. "Colonel Pace requested you receive it formally," Priya said. "There's a ceremony at Fort Callum next month. It's optional. Wall said the colonel would understand if you don't want to attend." Sarah looked at the document. The Army seal. Her name, typed, in the specific font of official citations. The language was formal and precise and named her role in the casualty response and the outcome. It named Cortez and Okafor by last name. It named Marcus by last name, which made her stop for a moment because she hadn't expected Marcus to be in it. "He submitted a supplemental," Priya said, noticing where she'd stopped. "Wall. He included Marcus's decision on the second CT." She looked at Okafor's name. She looked at Cortez's name. She thought about the morning those names had arrived on gurneys and the 40 minutes before that when she'd been in a parking lot being asked to produce a driver's license she hadn't needed to produce, and the specific math of how close those two things had been to intersecting in a way that couldn't be fixed. "I'll go to the ceremony," she said. She told Tom about it that afternoon, not because she needed to tell anyone, but because Tom had been there for all of it and had never once required anything from her in return, and that kind of presence deserved to be brought into the good parts. He was restocking the supply cart, and he listened to her describe the ceremony and the citation with the focused attention he brought to everything, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You know what gets me," he said. "About that morning." She waited. He had no idea. Tom set down the supply box. Rourke. He had no idea who he was talking to, not because of the military thing. I mean, the human thing. He had no idea who she was as a person. He looked at you and decided the answer before he asked the question. He looked at her directly. That's the part that should keep people up at night, not the outcome, the starting point. She held that. It was, she thought, the most accurate thing anyone had said about the whole business. Not the footage, not the documentation, not the reviews and the regulatory inquiries, and the oversight body's 41 pages. All of that was consequence. The starting point was a man looking at a woman in scrubs with a hospital badge on her chest and deciding, before a single fact was established, that she didn't belong where she was standing. The starting point was the most ordinary thing in the world. That was what made it hard to fix. Dramatic failures were easy to identify and point to. The ordinary ones, the ones that wore the face of procedure, of diligence, of just doing my job, those were the ones that compounded quietly across years and 7 cases, and a woman in Billings who'd left because leaving was the only option that hadn't been taken away. "Yeah," she said. Tom went back to the supply cart. She went back to her notes. Tamara Whitfield responded to Sarah's email on a Thursday morning. It was 4 paragraphs, longer than Sarah's 4 sentences, shorter than the story Whitfield had been carrying. It said that she'd read about the Marlowe General incident before the Courier piece ran, from a friend who still worked at the hospital. It said she'd felt something shift when she read it that she hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication exactly, because vindication implied that her experience had needed external confirmation to be real, and it had been real the whole time. More like witness. The feeling of having been seen in a room after a long time of being invisible in it. She said she'd received a letter from Ashby's office. Personal, handwritten postscript at the bottom. She said she hadn't known what to do with it yet. She asked if Sarah was doing okay. Sarah read the email twice. Then she wrote back and said she was doing okay. Which was true in the way that okay is always true. Imprecisely, incompletely, but genuinely. She said she didn't know what Whitfield should do with the letter because that wasn't a decision with a right answer. It was a decision about what you needed and what cost you were willing to carry, and only Whitfield could run that math. She said the fact that the letter existed and was handwritten and had a postscript was something, and something was different from nothing, even if something was not enough. She said, "I hope Billings is good." Whitfield wrote back 2 days later, "It is. Thank you for asking." They exchanged 3 more emails over the following month. Nothing dramatic, mostly ordinary things, the kind of correspondence between two people who understand something about each other without needing to explain it constantly. Whitfield mentioned she'd been asked to consult with the regulatory inquiry to provide context for her original complaint. She said she'd agreed. Sarah said, "Good, she meant it." He said, the Fort Callum ceremony was on a Saturday in late autumn. Sarah drove herself. 40 minutes north on roads that were starting to think about winter. The trees stripped, the sky doing something vast and gray that Montana skies do before the first snow. The kind of sky that makes you aware of how much space the world contains. The ceremony was in a large room at the base's administrative building. There were about 60 people there, Army personnel, civilian contractors, a few families. Wall was near the entrance when she arrived and shook her hand with the brevity of a person who communicates in efficient gestures and directed her to the front of the room. Marcus was there. He was standing near the chairs looking slightly formal, in a collared shirt that was a size too large. And when he saw her, he straightened in the same involuntary way he'd straightened in the hallway after Okafor's surgery. She thought about telling him that he didn't have to do that the posture was earned, not owed. But she was learning, slowly and imperfectly, when to say things and when to let people arrive at them in their own time. Cortez was in the 3rd row. He was in uniform, army dress, clean and correct. And he was sitting with a woman who had the specific energy of a person who'd spent several weeks in a state of terrified vigilance and was only recently beginning to believe she could put it down. His mother, probably. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her the nod that young men give when they don't have words for something and know that words would be insufficient anyway. She gave it back. Colonel Pace was taller than she'd expected from a phone call, lean, deliberate, with the slightly formal cadence of someone who'd given a lot of speeches and had learned to make them feel specific. He spoke for 12 minutes. He talked about the training accident and the response, and what the coordination between Fort Callum and Marlow General had meant in terms of outcome. He talked about what it looked like when a civilian and a military system worked together without friction and saved lives because of it. He paused before the last section. "There's a second reason we're here today," he said, "and I want to be direct about it because the military values directness and because the situation warrants it." He looked at Sarah. "Lieutenant Voss, I'm going to call you Lieutenant, because the rank was earned and the work you did on that day reflected it, was obstructed from entering the facility where her patients needed her. That obstruction has been addressed through appropriate channels, and I won't spend more time on it than it deserves." He paused. "But I want it on record, in this room, that the institutional response to that obstruction, the reviews, the accountability, the changes at both the hospital and the department level, did not happen automatically. It happened because someone stood their ground, worked their shift, and let the facts speak without amplification. That takes a different kind of discipline than anything we train for, and it deserves recognition." The room was quiet. She didn't know what to do with her face, so she did what she usually did, kept it neutral and let the moment exist without trying to manage it. Pace handed her the citation. She took it. He said quietly, for only her, "I read the footage notes. 11 minutes, 43 seconds, and you came in and ran that intake without missing a beat." He looked at her directly. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." She sat down. Marcus, beside her, was doing something with his jaw that suggested he was trying not to have a public reaction to anything. She thought that was probably the right instinct and didn't say anything to undermine it. Afterward, Cortez found her near the door. His mother was beside him, and she was the kind of woman who didn't waste time on preamble. She took Sarah's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without saying anything, and Sarah let her, because some things don't need words and don't benefit from them. Cortez said, "I heard about what happened before you came in that morning." "You didn't need to know about that." "I know, I found out anyway." He paused. He had the expression of someone who'd been thinking about something for 6 weeks and had arrived at a conclusion that was simple but hadn't been simple to reach. "I just want to say, it matters. That you came in anyway. She looked at him, 23 years old in his uniform, standing next to his mother in a room where he'd been formally recognized as someone who had survived. That's what the job is, she said. He nodded. He understood that she meant it exactly as she'd said it, not as deflection, not as modesty, but as a genuine description of what it meant to do this work. The job was coming in anyway. The job was standing where you were supposed to stand and doing what you were trained to do, and not requiring the situation to be fair before you started. The job was 11 minutes and 43 seconds of someone else's worst behavior, and then the doors opening, and then the work. That was all it was. That was everything it was. She drove home in the early dark, the mountains gone behind clouds, the road empty and straight. She had the window cracked slightly because she needed the cold air and the way you sometimes need things that are slightly uncomfortable, to stay present, to stay inside the moment instead of sliding past it. She thought about what Tom had said. The starting point. A man looking at a woman standing where she was supposed to be standing and deciding, before a single fact was established, that the answer was no. She thought about Whitfield and Billings, carrying a complaint for 14 months in a folder that said resolved on the outside and unheard on the inside. She thought about the 7 cases, the audit, the ombudsman position that was now in the process of being created, the regulatory inquiry, the 41 pages, the handwritten postscript. None of it was clean. None of it was complete. Institutions changed slowly and incompletely, and the people who'd been hurt by them healed on their own timelines, separately and imperfectly. And the gap between what had happened and what should have happened didn't close all the way just because someone finally looked at it directly. But the gap was smaller, and the record was different now. And somewhere in Billings, a woman had read her name in a story that used the right words, and somewhere in a hospital in Crestfall, a 23-year-old was getting up tomorrow morning and making breakfast and going to physical therapy and using a body that had almost not been available for any of those things. And somewhere in the administrative record of the Crestfall Police Department, there was a folder that would stay open for as long as the oversight body decided it should stay open, and that was not nothing. That was the slow, unglamorous, non-cinematic truth of how systems actually change. Not in a single confrontation, not in a dramatic reversal, but in the accumulation of documented facts that outlast the people who tried to make them go away. In the record that gets read in sequence and looks different than any single entry looked on its own. In the woman who said yes to the reporter because the structure had finally made it possible to say yes and be heard. Sarah pulled into her street. The lights were off in her apartment because she'd left before dawn and forgotten to leave one on, which was a small, ordinary thing that had nothing to do with any of it. She sat in the car for a moment in the dark. She thought about what she was going to do tomorrow. The answer was the same as it had been last Thursday, and the Thursday before that, and every working day for the past 7 months. She was going to go in early. She was going to check on her patients. She was going to do the work that needed doing with the precision it required. And when something went wrong, she was going to fix it. And when someone needed her to stand somewhere, she was going to stand there and not move. Not because she'd proven something, not because the world had rearranged itself into a fair shape, but because the patients were still there, because the work was still there, because she was still Sarah Voss, former combat medic, trauma coordinator, person who showed up 11 minutes before the doors stopped being someone else's obstacle and started being just doors again. And she was not going to let what had been done to her define the size of what she did next. She got out of the car. She went inside. She left the light on.